films. But it's been interesting to ask him about how he works, you know, he was nominated for an Academy Award, I think, too. But asking him from the inside perspective about performance, what's the phenomenology of it? What's the sort of process of getting good at it and all that? It's been kind of enlightening.
Yeah, there are also famous texts in anthropology about the difference and similarities of ritual and theater, which are interesting questions. The kind of awareness, the kind of collective identity sharing that's involved in some of the rituals, and how does it differ from theater? And then film. Film also has that third thing, the camera. Yeah.
Well, how did the Mind Foundation arise?
Well, a group of people founded it on the 26th of November 2016. And we actually had the first full SAB, Scientific Advisory Board, meeting yesterday, and we're telling the story of this organization and how we grew in the last year. I was basically into more cultural psychology and anthropological research on psychedelics for more than 10 years in this collaborative research area. And also got to know Albert Hoffman and most of the guys, mostly guys, who did the research in that field. And now with the psychedelic renaissance, it was just a time to build something that is European, that brings more rationality in it and tries to combine things. That's a longer discussion, but
yeah. But it's exciting, and it's classically, I mean, you'd have so much trouble in the United States getting this going because there's so many just cultural forces that are still extremely conservative and conventional, and it would be difficult, but I'm excited.
At the same time, the US has kickstarted that renaissance. So
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. I think the resistance is
fading,
pretty high in many parts of the world. Germany is also very conservative.
Yeah.
But the German Ministry of Education and Research approved 2.2 million of state money for this research, and that has not happened in the United States.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So where are we, David? It's 7:30.
Yes, that's correct.
I think usually more than half of the people come in the next 2 minutes, but we should not disappoint them. And maybe, Stephen, you can unshare your screen again.
Yeah. And I was going to go for an hour based on what you said I could do, if that's okay.
Yeah,
okay.
That's okay. That's
right.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, let's share. So, hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar with Stephen Asma from the United States. I'll introduce him in a second. I think we should start with the typical Mind Foundation ritual and asking you, where do you come from? Some have already begun, I know. So where does our audience come from? Some come from Berlin. Yeah, that's also good that we have people from Berlin in here. Maybe you want to tell us where you're from. Just post it in the chat. Paris, yeah. Usually we have a very international audience.
Very good.
It's Israel, Jerusalem. Hello. Zurich, Switzerland, United States, Connecticut, Ecuador. Hello. Yeah, London. That's a good way to wait for the others. Pennsylvania. Yeah, we're coming closer to Stephen, don't we?
Yes, we're very close. I see
Hamburg, Belgium. That's very nice. Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah.
I think we give it one more minute, and then I'm going to introduce Stephen. Are you in Chicago now?
I am in Chicago.
Yeah. Wonderful. Last week, we had a webinar that was diving more into the religious history of psychedelics, which we haven't done in the last years at all. That was also very interesting on the traces of the uses of psychedelic mushrooms in Christian history.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah. So, very different topic today. I think we should start. Yeah. So welcome again, everybody. I have the pleasure to welcome Stephen Asma for this webinar tonight. Stephen is a professor of philosophy at Columbia College, Chicago. He is a member of a research group with the name Mind, Science, and Culture. And Stephen is an author of 10 books. One to mention, The Emotional Mind. So, Stephen, my first question before we start with your talk: are you a Star Wars fan?
I would say that I am a Star Wars fan, but I am not a fanatic. The distinction, yes.
Thank you for differentiating that. So, there are people like the late U.S. American mythologist Joseph Campbell, who explained the success of George Lucas' Star Wars with the universal patterns of experience. Do you agree?
I agree. I sort of agree up to a point. And actually, the talk today will actually touch on this, not Star Wars particularly, but I do try to separate out what I think is a compelling claim about sort of universal mythopoetic themes from some of the stuff that's maybe more speculative. So yes, generally I do agree.
Yeah. So one of the ideas for asking you to give this webinar was that there definitely are phases or parts, segments of the psychedelic experience that patients report, and also people out beyond therapies that have that character of it's not only about the patient, it's more repeating patterns that they see. And so do you think that some of the theories that we'll hear tonight and explanations can relate to these personal patient-related experiences?
Yes, absolutely. I don't have a clinical background myself, but I do know some of this literature. I have friends who work in the field. I do think that the kind of work I do on the philosophy of imagination and the evolution of imagination it may not be the clearest connection yet to the clinical approach, but I do see, and I'm going to mention some connections, some threads that connect them. Yeah.
And last question before the stage is completely yours. Is there something like a biographical event or something that got you hooked on mythopoetic thinking and images?
That's a good question. I think, I can't say there was one particular event, but I do come from a visual arts background. Before I trained as a philosopher, I was studying fine arts, and that was my original goal, was to become a painter or an illustrator. And then I've encountered philosophy as an undergraduate and fell in love with it, and I abandoned one form of poverty for another, and eventually ended up in the last maybe 10 years or so thinking, imagery has really gotten short shrift in the academic fields, in my field of philosophy, even in psychology. And I thought, well, I'm going to try to, there was sort of a movement of a few of us trying to bring images back to the forefront of how the mind works as a kind of way of thinking or a kind of literacy. So that was the inspiration, yeah.
Thank you, Stephen. So the stage is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm now going to try to share my screen. Now, bear with me because this always takes a little bit of glitching here. Now let me get the view correct. So let me right away thank the Mind Foundation and Henrik in particular for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm going to talk for approximately an hour, only because I have a lot to say, and then hopefully we can have a discussion after that. I think some of the comments some of the conversation that we just had is really helpful to understand where I'm coming from. I just want to sort of inform sort of listeners and watchers about the work I've been doing over the last 10 years in particular. And so you'll see here that these are the books that I've been writing over the last 10 years or so. And this is essentially starting in about 2009 is when I published the book on monsters, an unnatural history of our worst fears. There is, by the way, a German translation of this. I don't know how successful it's been, but, and that book, well, the title really says it all. I'm looking at the way in which monsters appear in all human cultures for the most part. What are these sort of common universals? What are the idiosyncratic differences? And then a book on the evolution of imagination, and some of what I talk about today will be drawn from that. And then I wrote a sort of a Darwinian defense of religion from the point of view of these perspectives we've been talking about now. Are there adaptive rituals? Are there adaptive images that we find over and over again that help fuse together social solidarity and survival of groups? And finally, most recently with my colleague, Dr. Rama Gabriel, a book for Harvard called The Emotional Mind, in which we look at the affective neuroscience that emerged out of Dr. Jaak Panksepp's work and try to extend that up into areas like philosophy, psychology, and even cultural theory. All right, so let me start with a brief taxonomy of imagination. And here we might see a kind of obvious case as number one, that art and entertainment, the free playing of images and narratives, that's really what most people think of when they think of the imagination. And it's not wrong, but it's just woefully impoverished as a view of the imagination. People like Walt Disney or Hayao Miyazaki, the great Japanese animator, they were very good at composing images into very unique and fascinating sorts of novelties. But the imagination plays a huge role also in moral thinking as a kind of moral intuition pump. And this is getting more attention now in philosophy, but it's also taken a while. The dreaded trolley car problem that everyone's heard so much about is, after all, a kind of imaginative intuition pump to get us to think about what would we do if we had the lever controlling a trolley car to either, save 5 lives and kill 1, or the opposite. These are interesting ways in which we find out about our moral convictions and our moral intuitions, and it's largely imaginative work. That's what thought experiments are. Again, there's a lot of imagination in science. Doesn't quite get the legitimacy that I think it should, because we often teach science as just being the hypothetical deductive model, and that's fine. But in addition, there's a lot of imaginative work in science. I just included an image here of another famous thought experiment, namely the Turing test. And then finally, religious creativity is highly imaginative. This is some of the oldest image making, some of the oldest mythology and storytelling that human beings have, religion. And it's funny that we're very good at recognizing the imagination at work in other religions, but we don't tend to see it in our own religion. And I just find that kind of ironic. But finally, number 5 here is the faculty of imagination. And this is the one that I want to focus on for the purposes of this talk. This is the notion of imagination that comes as early as Plato and Aristotle, and then develops in Kant and all the way up to contemporary ideas in embodied cognition. So let me just try to sketch a little bit about what I mean by a faculty of the imagination. This is the idea that there's a cognitive architecture, a kind of a way of thinking with images. And if I ask you to think of a bird, the traditional way of philosophers talked about this was that you had a sort of definition of a bird. Let's say, it's a feathered biped of some kind. And then you looked for instances of that in experience, and they either fit in that categorical, conceptual category, or they didn't. And that's how we organize the world according to this other model. My own view is very much influenced by the work of Roche and my own teacher, Mark Johnson, in that there's really sort of prototype concepts where we have an image of a bird and then think of it as a hub with sort of radial spokes coming off of this hub. So if I ask you to think of a bird, most Europeans and Americans will think of, you know, robins, starlings, crows, blackbirds, and really that would be sort of at the hub of our conceptual category. And then out on the spokes would be things like, and quite far out, in fact, would be things like ostriches and penguins and so forth. It's not the first thing we think of. So the idea here is the imagination is itself a kind of part of the cognitive architecture of thinking with images. It allows us to actually make inferences, make predictions, and organize our experience. And Aristotle said this was the kind of marriage of image and concept. If you look at Aristotle's teacher, Plato, I think Plato bequeaths to us the kind of smug view of imagery, which is that it's always just a copy of something real, and it is not itself reality. Whereas Aristotle thought, no, in fact, images are part of the construction of knowledge. In fact, they're crucial because they organize sensual information or sensory information into under conceptual umbrellas, and this is what allows us to think better. Kant essentially continued this trajectory and argued that there is a faculty of the mind called the imagination, which was a kind of synthetic production system that delivered up concepts that had, you know, conceptual clarity, but also had sensory information such that we could use them in thinking of all kinds of matters of the imagination. So I would say that my own view lies mostly with the embodied cognition movement that's developed in the last decade or so. Depends on where you mark this, really. But I would call it the 5E program, not the usual 4E program. And by that, I mean the mind is embodied, it's extended, it's embedded, inactive, and it's emotional. It's usually the emotional that gets left off for some reason, but as you can imagine, in my work, it's crucial. So the mind is not some Cartesian, you know, spectator, but is in fact engaged in the world in a process of, you know, as Merleau-Ponty would say, you know, getting maximum grip on the environment so that we can basically survive in it. And 5E shows us that the mind operates by using images, metaphors, affect and emotion, affordances, and altogether this basically means that the imagination is a pre-linguistic system of meaning. It's the activity or the functioning of this 5E, these 5E relations. So I'll talk more about images and metaphors and a little bit about affect and affordances later in the talk. Perhaps it's worth just mentioning that the idea of affordances really is coming into my own thinking in a rather important way. And so I'm very interested in how it is that we and other animals, like mammals, are able to see in perception itself a lot of information about how to navigate and how to survive. So one of the things that we want to do is draw a distinction with regard to imagination between the voluntary and the involuntary imagination. There seem to be ways in which the imagination is under a kind of executive control, and then there's a way in which we're imaginative where there is no executive control, and it's kind of a free flow of ideas and images. So dreams really are a kind of paradigm of involuntary imagination. I give you this quote from Darwin's Descent of Man, where he says, the imagination is one of the highest prerogatives of man. By this faculty, he unites former images and ideas independently of the will, and thus creates brilliant and novel results. Dreaming gives us the best notion of this power. As poet Jean-Paul says, the dream is an involuntary art of poetry. And I just love this quote because it seems to capture so many things about our own phenomenology of the dream life, but also if you look at it in the context of Darwin's argument in The Descent of Man, he's showing the tremendous cognitive and mental solidarity that we have with other non-human animals. All right, what's happening in the dreaming brain? How is it spontaneously creative? And the research on this is really coalescing. and we're getting a much better picture. But some of this is contentious, some of it's arguable, some studies contradict each other, but I do think you're getting a kind of, a kind of density distribution of ideas about the dreaming brain. Serotonin changes depending on what state, sleep state you're in, but generally speaking, the prefrontal cortex turns off, so to speak, and the limbic system turns up. And so there's some research to show that when you're in certain kinds of REM sleep, the brain seems to be behaving or acting inside almost as if you're on a foraging expedition. So the seeking system is driving hot. It's just that the sort of the prefrontal cortexes are sort of shut off. And this is exciting because it seems to also parallel with our understanding of two developing brain systems. And I'm sure many of you are aware of these two brain systems. I want to talk a little bit about this. The default mode network is basically the sort of network when our mind is at rest. And it's basically when we're doing this kind of mind wandering. So you sit in the classroom while your teacher's droning on, and you're just sort of daydreaming away. And this mind wandering really does have a sort of a brain signature to it. That's to be contrasted with the attentional network, or what I'm going to be calling the task positive network. And here, this is more active during tasks that are engage specific directed attention. So when you're working a math problem or doing playing a chess game or even checking your email on your phone, the brain is usually in this task positive modality. It is sort of teleologically driven towards goal states. It's organizing the means towards those goal states. And it looks quite different from the default mode network. Now, what we've just discovered in recent years is that the dreaming brain really is a kind of intensified mind-wandering brain. So the default mode network seems to be very similar in REM sleep and in these cases of waking mind-wandering. And this is fairly exciting because it seems to confirm what many of us sort of suspected phenomenologically anyway. And so it raises interesting questions then about issues like mindfulness. So when this research was first done, I think the default mode network was frequently thought to be the place where flow states occurred. So as you know, psychologists over the last 20 years have been describing something that Zen Buddhism has been describing for thousands of years, maybe a century or 1,500 years, namely that the mind is able to essentially go into highly associational modes, what maybe William James would have called like the blooming, buzzing confusion. And so at first, the DMN was thought to sort of be a kind of flow state, a free associational state. More recently, what I've noticed is that it's actually been found to be very much on and operating during autobiographical ruminations. And so now we're beginning to understand, actually, it's not that the DMN is like Buddhist mindfulness, or rather like associational flow states. It may in fact be more like Buddhist mindfulness. I was actually talking to a Zen monk last year and was asking him about this research. And I just read that the task positive network was actually the dominant network while they sort of did brain imaging on a Tibetan Buddhist monk. And he said, well, there's no surprise there because trying to bring your mind into the present moment, it requires incredible effort and not the sort of lazy, free-floating imagery, perhaps, of the default mode network. So in any case, this is emerging. It's becoming clear, but it's not entirely clear yet. All right, what are we doing in these cases? In most of these cases, what's happening is what's called transient hypofrontality. And I describe this as disengaging the brain brake. So as many of you know, it's the frontal areas of the brain are involved in executive control. And what we've been able to discover is that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is here in a kind of purple gray, if you can see this, hopefully you can see my cursor. this is very much on and active during task positive kinds of activities, but it seems to shut down during creative and imaginative activity. And in fact, when it shuts down, you get more activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the orbital frontal prefrontal cortex. And this image on the right-hand side, perhaps some of you will recognize, is a fairly interesting study done by a neuroscientist named Charles Lim. And he was looking at musicians while they played music in an fMRI machine. He created this keyboard, you could lay down and play. And what he found was that if you asked someone to play a Bach, invention from memory, or to even sight read some piece of music, then the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was on and sort of processing. But if you asked a musician to actually improvise, to make up something sort of de novo, entirely new, like a jazz improviser or even, a hip hop, improviser, then the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex turns off, and then you get this activity of transient hypofrontality that I'm describing. And it's just very exciting research that is only now getting sort of extrapolated out. Some interesting recent experiments that just strengthen this view is that if you use the transcranial magnet interference on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, then you basically discombobulate that processor. But then if you ask people afterwards, your control group and then those who've had the interference, to solve some sort of creative problem that requires, lateral or untraditional thinking, people who've had that part of the brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, interfered with, end up doing much better on these creative tasks. It's almost like you have to take the brake off in order for the mind to then enter lateral thinking states and sort of fresh trajectories of thought, so that you don't keep doing the same sort of rehearsed problem-solving techniques. Now, what are the techniques for disengaging the brakes? Notoriously, this is where, I think Einstein once said that when he was working on a problem, presumably in task positive network mode, and he couldn't figure out the solution, he would work on it and labor on it, but eventually he would stop and he would leave and go ride his bicycle. And he might even do this for days on end. And the suggestion here is that the mind has its kind of conscious operating system, but when you leave a problem alone, then at this subconscious level, the problem can still be worked on. And Einstein said suddenly he'd be riding his bike or stepping onto a bus, and a solution to his problem would suddenly present itself. It's almost as if the subconscious is doing this kind of associational work, pairing things, and then sometimes these emerge into the conscious mind and turn out to be very beneficial for the problems that we're working on. I'm a big fan of a visual artist named Sean Tan, and he's extremely imaginative, and he was saying he felt like part of his creative process was sort of fishing in the subconscious. So it's like you have a fishing pole and you throw it in, you don't know exactly what you're going to get, and out comes some strange creature or some fish that you didn't expect, and it turns out to have some value for the creative project. And he argued that becoming an artist and sustaining this creative life is learning how to fish the subconscious effectively. I generally think as a metaphor, this is helpful. But of course, people would go on nature hikes. One thinks about the Romantic movement, get out of the laboratory and into nature. And one thinks about the intoxicants like absinthe, which I think Toulouse-Lautrec and Van Gogh, I think they called this the green fairy. And then, of course, psychedelics. So LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, and so forth. So I want to sort of deviate slightly and enter into some of this material because I know the audience a little bit here. And while I'm no expert on psychedelics, I've certainly had a fair share of personal experiences with them, and hope that maybe the phenomenological aspects will bear fruit. Before we get to that, I also want to just mention that there are, in fact, not just, chemicals or personal choices for disengaging the brake, but there are in fact cultures for disengaging the brake. And I just mentioned three of them here. I'll follow up on two of them just briefly to remind people that whole cultural movements have been structured around this idea of sort of transient hypofrontality. I mentioned the often maligned but neglected Hermetica tradition of analogical mind. So I know fans of magic out there will get what I'm saying right away, but it was very common for this sort of trajectory, which runs alongside the official history of science in the West. It was very common for this trajectory to think about knowledge not as an analytical method, but as a kind of associational connotative work, where you used the mind to do creative intuitions and to create images, and imagination was considered actually kind of divine. I mentioned also here the ecstatic catharsis traditions that are so familiar to many of us. I just recently had the good fortune of reading Euripides the Bacchae again. The last time I read it, I think I was a teenager, and I confess that I didn't get it at all. Now I get it, and it's way more disturbing and frightening than I remember. This image alone, Pentheus, the main character, is being ripped to pieces by his own mother during a bacchanalian revelry. And I simply point this out as a way of reminding us that the adventure to the transient hypofrontality mind is not always going to be the sunny, optimistic stroll in the park that one might imagine, because of course, in fact, this is where you also dredge up some of the more terrifying aspects of the unconscious. Not just the sort of aggression and lust and so forth, but just genuine terror. And then again, the tradition of Zen and emptiness, this is perhaps a little bit to the side of my main argument, but I think you'll see why I bring this up here in a moment. A lot of work with transient hypofrontality is trying to also access a kind of pure consciousness or a refined notion of consciousness. And of course, in Buddhism and the meditation techniques generally, people have been doing this for, again, thousands of years. Just to maybe say a few more words about Hermetica. In Hermetic traditions, everything is something else. So the body is a coded system of signs. And these refer to places on the body, but also refer to the cosmos and astrological relations. And this comes out of the Asclepius and the Corpus Hermeticum and all of that stuff that the Renaissance writers like Ficino sort of translated. But really, if you talk about the essential ideas, it's the idea of intuitive insight first, the synthetic and creative, and this is prized over discursive deduction, which is seen as analytic and destructive. It's the idea that imagination creates new realities, and so that reveals a divine aspect. And then the other thing I'm sort of excited about in the Hermetic tradition is that images, they get their due. They're thought of as ways to reach upward from the senses to the intellect and achieve, as above, so below. I think many of you know that the metaphysics of this tradition has a kind of, the one is an emanation source, and then there's like chains down to this world. So the idea in terms of knowledge and wisdom is to sort of understand these chains. And I put it to you that this is a way of thinking without the traditional task positive, executive, orderly, deductive, and logic format. The Zen tradition, I think as many of you know, is a Japanese development of Chinese Chan, which is a development of the Indian jhana. The actual term mindfulness is a translation of the Pali term sati, but I just simply wanted to mention it because so many of us who have done psychedelics have had an experience like this. And one wonders, okay, how do we connect this to the other things that we're experiencing in these altered states of consciousness? The Japanese idea of mano no aware is the idea of an impermanence of all things, and that if you can attend to this properly, It's the finitude and impermanence of the thing that actually makes it so meaningful, significant, and precious. This is really symbolized by the culture of the cherry blossom in Japan. I quote here on the left side of the slide the tale of the Heike clan from the 13th century. Quote, "The sound of the bells echoes the impermanence of all things. The color of the solar flowers reveals the truth that the prosperous must decline, the proud do not endure. They are like a dream on a spring night. The mighty fall at last. They are as dust before the wind." And if we just now extend this philosophically, we have to sort of take into consideration the idea of shunyata, which translates into emptiness. And here, if you look on the lower side of the right, I've sort of described the three main areas where the meditator, practitioner achieves some notion of emptiness. First is the emptiness of the self, sometimes called anatta or anatman. Here, the Buddha rejects the idea that you have a permanent essential self that you're going to encounter and experience. This is largely a construct. And the Buddha thought that even though it was popular in Hinduism, he thought it was a mistake. We also achieve an awareness of the emptiness of things. Things don't have an essence. They are not autonomous and differentiated from each other, but they're like a node in a kind of web of relationships or of dependent arising. And this is called paticca samuppada. And finally, there's an emptiness of the mind itself, bhavanga prabhasvara citta, which is clearing the mind of all content so that it's just sort of bare consciousness. Now, I think many of us, myself included, have had psychedelic experiences where we felt like we did feel, the oneness of all things, or certainly the impermanence or the web of dependent arising. And I find this just an exciting territory to then connect to some of my interests in cognitive science and philosophy of mind. So let's try to make some sense out of this. Let me check how I'm doing here on time. Oh, not too bad. All right. So psychedelic investigation, finding cognitive universals, question mark. One of the things I think Henrik was pointing out at the beginning, I think is right, is many of us who've had these experiences and who are doing research in this area feel quite convinced that there's something beyond just the individual experience. And so let me sort of break this into three major categories. It's fairly artificial to do this, but I think you'll see what I'm up to. First, there's the question of imaginative and ideational content. When you go within, do you find, in fact, narrative universals? Do you find image universals? Do you find, for example, is it the case that we would all agree that we saw something that was, that had a particular geometry, or as is sometimes related in ayahuasca research, many people have reported the having a kind of waking hallucination where they themselves were disassembled and then reassembled again. And so these are very intriguing possibilities. Are there universal embodied schema? Here I'm thinking about the kind of work that comes out of Mark Johnson and George Lakoff's work, where if you think about human beings, because we have sort of the vision we have and the body orientation we have a tendency to, we have a world that's sort of horizontally distributed, if I can use that term. So we have a tendency to see things as being focal or being peripheral. And so we actually think in terms of this metaphor frequently, like I'll say things like, oh, that idea is really, is really central, or that idea is really way out. It's very common for us to use these kind of embodied schema for really radically different kinds of conversations. Are the conceptual universals. Number two here, I've listed sort of cognitive architecture. Is it possible that one can encounter during psychedelic investigation the actual cognitive architecture that we might all share as universals? I am of the view that we have a kind of limited number of natural kind emotions. I do believe we have affective universals. I think the work of affective neuroscience bears that out, although it's in contention now. There are some who think that emotions are more like social or cognitive constructs, but I'm fairly positive that there's a kind of lust system, there's a kind of anger system or rage system, there's a care system, there's a seeking system, there's a play system. We've got a lot of good data on how rats and mice love to play. We can even sort of track their laughing, and so I think that there are universal affective core emotions that we not only share across human beings, but many of them are homologous across the mammalian clade. A lot of mammals have some of this stuff. But can we also appreciate our perceptual universals as well in this kind of investigation? And then thirdly, this stuff cannot be arrived at phenomenologically and requires things like brain imaging and good brain imaging and good science. But are there in fact cognitive pathways that are common to, these sort of transient hypofrontality experiences? Is there a cortico-cerebral, subcortical, circuit? Is there some specific toggling between the TPN and the default mode network? Is there something in the ventral tegmental area that's happening? And this research is starting to emerge and is exciting. Just quickly, maybe as an aside, there's some wonderful work by Robert Barton about the way in which the cerebellum has been really neglected, and much more work has been focused on the evolution of the cortex. But he's been able to show that the cerebellum in primates, particularly the great apes, is incredibly elaborate and complex and evolved very rapidly during the same time period as the cortex expansion. And this has some interesting implications. Okay, if you look at the quote on the bottom of this slide, I just want to share with you something from Andrew Jones, and I think this is helpful. There are two broad views in current psychedelics research. According to mind manifesting views, psychedelics are therapeutically valuable because they facilitate access to unconscious material. Alternatively, according to mind modifying views, psychedelics produce benefit by disrupting rigid thought patterns and increasing psychological flexibility. However, these views are sometimes conflated in current research. And that's been my experience too, is that we're not taking enough time to get conceptual clarity on this. And I caution us and myself really to make sure, obviously when I'm referring to the imaginative ideational content in number one, it's really more like mind manifesting. But changing one's mood states and affective states from depression to, non-depressed is really a different kind of modification. All right, so then this brings me to what I'm calling the content problem. And I want to hover on this just for a moment, because so much good work has been done by Jungians, but it's not uncontroversial. If we look at this quote that I gathered from Jung, and I grabbed it because here he's talking about alchemy, and I was referring to magic earlier, so I like this quotation from Psychology and Alchemy. Jung says here on the left-hand side, I am therefore inclined to assume that the real root of alchemy is to be sought less in philosophical doctrines than in the projections of individual investigators. I mean by this that while working on his chemical experiments, the operator had certain psychic experiences, which appeared to him as the particular behavior of the chemical process. Since it was a question of projection, he was naturally unconscious of the fact that the experience had nothing to do with matter itself, that is, with matter as we know it today. He experienced his projection as a property of matter, but what he was in reality experiencing was his own unconscious. In this way, he recapitulated the whole history of mankind's knowledge of nature. Such projections repeat themselves whenever man tries to explore an empty darkness and involuntarily fills it with living form. So I think this is just a wonderful expression of the Jungian view. In early Jung's work, there's more talk about primordial images, but of course many people are familiar with the archetypes, the shadow, the anima, animus, the mother, the trickster, the hero. And as Henrik was pointing out at the beginning, that one wonders, is that what happens when when someone like Joseph Campbell looks at myth, and then someone like George Lucas makes Star Wars? Are we simply tapping a phylogenetic memory. Now, here's the problem. I've listed here on the bottom right-hand side, and these problems are not insurmountable, but we have to sort of work on them to go forward. A, there's no inheritance of acquired traits. Now, this is obviously a Lamarckian view of evolution is wrong because of the central dogma of DNA, but, and I say this well aware of the recent work in epigenetics. So in the recent epigenetic research, it's very exciting. We're able to actually show that certain kinds of, well, let's say metabolic timing or processes, or things like obesity, for example, we've now been able to show that if in your lifetime, you might have certain relationships with food, and that changes your metabolic clock, and amazingly through epigenesis, this actually can have an influence on the next generation, your children, and even your grandchildren. The experiment that I find very exciting, and I'm sure some of you are aware of, is that they did a sort of fear conditioning experiment with mice. I think it was mice, where they associated the smell of oranges with, you know, a foot shock probably. And so the animal ended up having a fear response whenever it smelled oranges. And remarkably, even this fear seemed to have an epigenetic manifestation in the following 2 generations. Now that's very exciting, and that might be the path forward. But B, there's no evidence of innate content. And what I mean by that is there's certainly the report of people like myself who want to say there is innate content. On the other hand, the empirical research is not there. And the work that's been done, I think, by Elizabeth Spelke and maybe Paul Bloom too, with some of these baby labs, suggests that what you have in form of core cognition is really more like we're all born with a sense of folk physics. But these are not ideas or content in the way that the magic tradition would have described, or even in the way that Jung would have described. This is just babies seem to know not to go out, you know, over a plexiglass barrier because they do seem to innately know that there's danger there. Except my kid, he would have gone out. He would have failed this experiment, I'm sure. In any case, what I want to suggest is that in some, there's no compelling evidence yet for genetic memory. However, what is exciting is that ontogeny sort of comes to the rescue on this stuff, because what I think is happening in childhood development, or the development of the organism, is enough to give us what look like innate but highly entrenched universals. And so how does this happen? Social learning and sticky means. Human beings, as has been shown by great research in the last decade, are highly social in terms of how they learn. We seem to be primed to follow and mimic the activities of other human beings, namely at our earliest phase, our parents. We learn through simulation, mimicry, and conditioning. And this allows us to absorb an enormous amount of information, which could be behavior, could be images, and eventually is going to be stories and music. In fact, the work on music here is really getting exciting, because now we're beginning to understand how some of the universals in how we hear music are actually the result of ontogenetic processes like this. So you combine that with what I will call viral imagery, mimetics, and you can see how we could end up with some kind of common notions, myths and imagery that basically developed early in our own lifetimes. If you look on the right-hand side, I want to also add another sort of candidate here for understanding universals, and that is Patrick Hogan's work. And he's looked at the affective or emotional systems and looked at stories, and he's found a fairly, when I read this, I thought, of course, but I hadn't thought of it before. He's found a remarkable correlation between the emotional systems and the handful of plots, story plots that human beings seem to replicate. So if you look at the number of stories, the kind of stories that humans tell each other, they break down into, you could count them on one hand. His suggestion is that romantic plots found all over the world are narrative expressions of the lust system. described by affective neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp. And the typical horror plot is a narrative expression of the fear system, whereas tragedies are expressions of the grief system, and the grief system is basically a separation distress system. And then mysteries and hero stories enact the seeking system, and so on. So here the argument is something like you've got this internal force, which is emotional, behavioral, and cognitive, and it basically activates during certain kinds of experiences, and then the higher mind is able to connect particular environmental inputs to those affective systems. So this is a very simple example, but it's the same brain chemistry for a rat as it is for me when we're undergoing fear. It's same neurotransmitters, same parts of the brain are activated. Even the behavioral suite is the same. But humans are afraid of the dark, whereas rats are afraid of the light. And if you continue sort of ratcheting up this process of sort of inputting data from experience and from culture, because again, we're social learning, then you eventually end up arriving at the kinds of images and stories that you find in horror or tragedy or what we call, the artistic or aesthetic life. All right, so all of this then got me to think about is there a universal grammar of the imagination? And I think there is. I'm going to talk a little bit just for a moment about imagery, but this could apply to things like music. And I think people have talked about a universal grammar for language, of course, ever since Chomsky, suggested a deep generative grammar. Is there something like that for images? And what I want to suggest is provisionally that we as human beings are very good at hybridizing or creating these cognitive mashups. So if you look at the history of human culture, you will find zoological category violations where 2 or 3 animals are mashed together. If you look at this imagery I've included here, you can see in the upper left-hand corner, you see Ganesh, who is part elephant and human, part God. Below that, you see the image in the lower left-hand corner is actually from Gilgamesh, the earliest story that we have from human beings. And even in there, Gilgamesh and Enkidu go to fight Humbaba. Humbaba is a hybrid creature, a monster made of different animals. And so you can see that there's many examples here, from the Sphinx to the Lion Man, which is that little figurine discovered in Germany. I think the Lion Man is like, I want to say between 30 and 40,000 years old. And so if you look at this list here, I've included here 4 possible modalities of a kind of universal grammar of imagination. What do? We actually can achieve these sticky memes by multiplying parts. So it's common if you're trying to convey the power of a creature, like in the Hindu tradition, well, 2 arms are powerful, but 10 arms are even better. Or you can, number 2, be blending taxonomic categories. Number 3, domain crossing, taking a creature from the water and putting it in the sky and vice versa. And also blending metaphysical categories. It's common to think of, well, this thing is dead, but it's also alive, the zombie. And so it's the undead. These kinds of things form very strong mimetic sort of nodes that spread through culture very quickly. And so my provisional conclusion then here is that the universals of cognitive architecture, this processing, this grammar of imagination, and the architecture and the processing, they produce seemingly universal images, ideas, and content. And maybe one more point on this, just to clarify it a little better. It's very common for Europeans to have some kind of werewolf mythology. What's interesting about that is you get some sort of human creature regressing to its animal form and then back again, some sort of shape-shifting. But if you look at, but the werewolf is not universal. The shape-shifting is universal. So in Native American culture, you don't have a werewolf, you have a werebear. In Indonesia and Africa, you have the were-crocodile. So this is the point I'm driving at. All right, let me say a couple of comments then. This sort of brings in the Zen stuff I was talking about earlier, because one of the investigations, by using psychedelics is, I think, at least, and I know some of the literature bears this out, that it's one of the ways in which to actually have an experience of unitive consciousness. So let me just read through this to get this out in a quick fashion. My argument so far suggests that we will look in vain for specific innate image content in the mind manifesting and the mind modifying uses of psychedelics. The specific symbology of alchemy is unlikely to be found within unless you've already put it there. So for example, I don't think you're going to have a lot of people engaging in psychedelics or other forms of transient hypofrontality and therefore discover within, the pentagram shapes or something, or any of the other sort of symbols from the Hermetic tradition. But if you've already studied the Hermetic tradition, then of course you're going to find those. And that's part of the idiosyncratic. And of course, this is also part of the therapeutic value of this work. In fact, almost so far, I think little of this has a clinical dimension, but what I'm going to say here next, I think will in the following couple slides. But Zen, to sort of continue this quote, but Zen culture, meditation, and psychedelic experiences do seem to produce universals, in part because they empty content altogether. In other words, what's happening in those experiences, you're trying to cleanse the mind of ideational and image content. And what you arrive at is something like the bare awareness of the operating system, which doesn't, I feel weird calling it an operating system, but that's what it is. So in the religious imagination, conceptual thinking drives theology and makes possible a more systematic representation of universals. Before these modes of representation, however, lies what Piaget and Inhelder called the adualism of the child, the state of consciousness before an integrated self. The distinction or boundary between self and world is not an early datum for the infant. It emerges slowly through experience. And Robert Bellah calls this the unitive experience and suggests that it precedes the more content-rich representational modes, serving as a crucial touchstone for later religious thought. To quote Bellah, the unitive event then is a kind of ground zero with respect to religious representations. It transcends them, yet it requires them if it is to be communicable at all. Christian negative theology and the Buddhist teaching of emptiness, shunyata, attempt to express this paradoxically by speaking of nothingness, the void, silence, or emptiness. All right, so let's bracket that now, and in the few minutes I have left here, and in the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to attempt to connect a lot of this to what I think are the adaptive values of the imagination. If imagination is an illusion maker, a counterfactual generator, then why do we have it? Now, hopefully at this point, you've come to appreciate that I don't think this is the best way to describe the imagination as just an illusion maker, but that was how it was trotted out back in the 90s, I think, when Steven Pinker famously said, well, the imagination is a kind of cognitive cheesecake. It was not selected for, it's not adaptive. It really is just a byproduct of having a really good problem-solving, brain. Now, I don't share that view. I suspect that view is waning, thankfully. And my own view is that the imagination is, in fact, an adaptive system. Now, how is it an adaptive system? It's my own view that just as some of the great work that's coming out now by Andy Clark on predictive processing is showing us how the mind might be operating to adaptively predict its environment and changes, I think my view of imagination dovetails nicely with this view. And so if we look on the left-hand side, our experience is not a passive mirror of nature, but rather our mind brain uses internal concepts, models, and imaginative constructions, fantasia as the Greeks called it, to predict immediate and distant events. The mind brain uses prior experience, priors, as a template against which errors or novelties jump out, and then we adjust the template accordingly. Now, I don't think that's wrong. On the right-hand side, you'll see why I think it can be improved upon. And I want to suggest that the imagination as a 5E processor, of templates, which is pictorial, dramatic, mythopoetic, these make sense of experience, what is the case, and also they make future what can be the case. And I would say that the major difference between my own view and the kind that's emerging out of Andy Clark's work is that that work seems to be thinking entirely about predictive processing as a kind of Bayesian statistical prediction system based on experience. And I think this is probably misguided, and that instead the way in which we're making predictions and having priors is analog. Images stored with affective somatic markers, these kind of conditioned associational frameworks, I think, are the way forward. All right. Perhaps the best way to summarize a lot of this is to say that mythopoetic cognition is really the imperative mind. I want to draw a distinction between the indicative mind, if you think about grammar, which simply says or describes what a thing is, and the imperative mind, which is basically involved in approaching, avoiding, doing something. So after World War II, archaeologists Henri and Henrietta Frankfurt proposed the theory that pre-axial age mind was mythopoetic. The mythopoetic paradigm or perspective sees the world primarily as a dramatic story of competing personal intentions rather than a system of objective impersonal laws. For them, they looked at Martin Buber's idea of I, thou, instead of I, it, and they said, yeah, in a way, our ancestors thought of all of nature as a thou. It wasn't a machine that just functioned according to predictable natural laws. It was, in fact, a kind of set of persons or a person. And so what are some of the most fundamental mythopoetic templates? It's agency attribution. You tend to think that the tree is a person. It's teleological thinking. So you think that the tree is for the sake of this bird. And also it's affectively entangled. The way you feel about it is relevant to what nature really is. So that's, again, these are different ways of operating the world that I'm calling mythopoetic. And instead of talking about movies or literature, I want to just mention animism, because animism, I think, is probably the oldest form of collective cultural cognition. And it is sort of, to define animism, we would say there are many kinds of persons, only some of whom are humans. And this is the idea that we think of again, as the tree or the forest as having a personality. The river is angry with us. These are the kinds of things you'll see, not just in what we would call pre-literate cultures, but alive and well in traditions like Japanese Shinto. And what I'm arguing is that animism, which has been dismissed, I think, by the history of anthropology, people like Tyler and Freud said, this is just a stepping stone to science. And now that we've got science, we can forget about animism. That's just primitive. I beg to differ, and I think that animism is a form of cognition that is adaptive. Now, how is it adaptive? It's adaptive in the following ways. It provides traditional ecological knowledge. It's now the case that biologists are working with indigenous people to understand, even though they're working from an animist mythopoetic cognition, to understand how does the whale population relate to the seal population, which relates to the ice flows. But, there's all these wonderful ecological relations. So it's adaptive in that sense. Animism is very good at helping with social intelligence. One of the things I noticed, I lived in Cambodia for a while and traveled in Laos and Vietnam and Burma and Thailand. Animism there is still alive and well, very much so, just below the surface of the official Buddhism. And you oftentimes are trying to make sacrifices to the spirits every morning so that they will not trouble your own family. And this kind of constantly assuaging of other agents in nature is, after all, a kind of social intelligence, because you have to align your own teleological goals with the teleological goals of all these other agents. And I suggest that this is very adaptive because it really improves social intelligence. It's highly therapeutic, and it also is important for threat rehearsal. I want to just give, I think, 2 or 3 examples very quickly here of evidence. There's a wonderful paper that just came out by friends and colleagues of mine, Colton Scribner and Matthias Clausen, where they did some work on the pandemic. And they correlated through a whole bunch of surveys. They asked people, okay, are you fans of zombie apocalypse movies or these prepper movies where it's going to be the end of the world, and so you sort of store all your food. And then they correlated that with, so they showed a group that was very much into this kind of imaginative narrative, and people who were not. And they showed that people reported on a number of metrics that they were doing all right during the COVID-19 lockdown. People basically who were used to these kinds of movies and had a taste for them felt better. They weren't as depressed. They reported feeling more positive affect. They weren't stressed. They weren't losing sleep. So that's an interesting sort of case of evidence that imaginative things like movies, literature, and storytelling is a kind of threat rehearsal. And this confirms some of what Keith Oatley calls fiction as a kind of mind's flight simulator. This perhaps is one of the more relevant pieces for the clinicians, and that is another bit of evidence I take this from a very recent work by Hamilton, where monster imagery and the processing of trauma seems to be getting some work now. Many trauma victims experience involuntary emergence of specific monster imagery during triggered episodes. These monsters intrude into consciousness, waking and dreaming, and act as both a phenomenologically threatening presence and a symbol of earlier trauma. And carefully facilitating therapeutic revisiting of such imagery and scenarios is effective sense-making activity and helps patients process otherwise abject terrors. For example, using storytelling and even film, therapists can place the trauma monster into a teleological narrative that has a resolution. It can be defeated, repudiated, accepted, transformed, and so on. And then this is the last slide and the last point I'll make, and then hopefully we can have more discussion. Again, this is highly anecdotal, and it's a story told by Nick Cave. Many of you know the musician Nick Cave. Very tragically, he lost his son a few years ago. His teenage son fell off of a cliff and died as a result of his head injuries. Obviously, Nick Cave was shattered by this, as any parent would be. And Cave has a blog at his website where he actually talks to fans and answers questions. And recently, this appeared on his blog. And I know it's 3 paragraphs. I'm going to read it. It's going to be worth it, I promise you. But it really does, I think, get at the point of the power of imagination. He is asked by a fan to advise him because the fan has lost a loved one as well. Is there anything that Nick Cave can say to help? And Nick says, quote, "My well-meaning and desperately worried friends would speak into my grief using words that made no sense. They would tell me that my son lived in my heart, for example, but when I searched my heart, I found nothing but chaos and despair. One desperate morning, however, I did the most simple of things, and perhaps this can help you with the loss of your wife and your brother. I sat by myself in a quiet space and called upon my son by name. I closed my eyes and imagined lifting him from my heart, this tormented place in which I was told he lived, and I positioned him outside of my body, next to me, beside me. I said, 'You are my son, and now you are beside me.' These few words had a powerful vibrational effect, and this simple act of imagination was the first step in a process that would eventually lead me back to the world. By performing this act, I was temporarily released from the rational world, a merciless place that gave me no peace, and given access to an impossible realm where I could form an increasingly resolute relationship with the spiritual idea of my lost child. I began to feel Arthur's presence. I talked to him, he talked to me, I took him with me wherever I went. I toured Europe and America with the In Conversation show, and he sat with me in my dressing room, or later at night in my hotel, or he escorted me onto stage and stood there beside me. I felt emboldened by his constructed presence, or perhaps true presence, who knows? What did it matter? I felt increasingly empowered, unafraid, as I allowed him to accompany me out of my boundless grief. Sometimes on stage, I would look out at the audience and feel a collective spiritual influence attending to everyone. It was a deeply powerful experience and testament to the restorative force of our imaginings. That child of God, that divine invention, rescuing me from my catastrophic heart, and in doing so, freeing himself from the convulsion of my grief. And I just want to close there. And I think it's a good place to round out the discussion. Hopefully you've seen a kind of theory about how the imagination works as a cognitive system and what some of its adaptive functions could be. So thank you very much, and I'll draw my formal conversation comments to a close there.
Wonderful, Stephen, for a great talk. I think that was very interesting for also the audience. We have a number of questions, and I think we'll not get bored in the next minutes. So, are you ready? I'm just choosing from some of these questions. So
Yes.
let's start with maybe you'll go back to some of what you already explained. So one of the persons from the audience asked, is there a way to explain phenomenological accounts of children who tell us that they narrated former lives, that they have pre-birth memory? And there are some phenomenological stories there that are a little bit disturbing. So people from families that don't seem to be Buddhists and have no family recollection of talking about it and things like that. How could that be explained?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm probably, I think my views are kind of on a continuum, as you can tell from my presentation, and I don't rule anything out. But I also don't rule anything in until there's compelling evidence. Those claims, I think, are so strong and controversial that they require a high level of evidence. My own view is I don't want to rule out the possibility of former lives and so forth, but I will tell you as a Buddhist of the Theravada tradition, which doesn't really believe in the soul transmigrating in the way that like Hindus do, or even maybe Tibetan Buddhists believe. And also as a Darwinian, I don't believe in transmigration in this way, or at least I need convincing on this. I do think, however, that there could be some of the mechanisms I described earlier, namely the social learning function, the mimetic quality of the human mind, which is very good at grabbing behaviors and images from the environment and then basically placing them in the memory for semantic memory work, for episodic memory work. I think that children could end up having a lot more wisdom by the time they're able to speak. Because if you think, I'm trying to remember when my kid was able to speak. I don't know what the data on this is. What could you speak at 4, 5, let's say? By then, you've had a lot of not just programming, but you've had a lot of cognitive absorption of the environment. And the thing about human beings, the fact that we're all born prematurely from the point of view of the brain development, we've got to get down this small birth canal. So what's happened is basically the brain is not well formed compared to other species, so that when you're born, you have this very long sort of period of dependency on your parents. And that means that, as everyone knows, what fires together wires together. Lots of stimuli from the image world, the sensory world, the emotional world is actually creating emotional memories, image memories. And I believe that some of this stuff could rise up once the child has speech and end up looking like it's a previous life. That's a skeptic's response to the question, but I'm not dismissive of it at all. I just think it needs more work.
Thank you for providing this explanation. So I'm taking it into another direction. There are two related questions. I think one is from the beginning of your talk when you gave a classical Lakoff and Johnson example with a bird, and how we would, when somebody says the word bird, which kind of things that we would imagine. So he or she says, would it be safe to say that concepts of birds, for example, are not only experience sensitive, but also context sensitive? Taking the bird example, if you're asked about the concept of a bird in a zoo, you might think of a different bird than if you're asked at a restaurant, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. I totally agree. I've tried to telescope out from a narrow view of concepts to experience, but I think the questioner is right. We also have to think of the context, the ecology of the bird. There's an interesting psychology test that they've run on people of Western descent and people of Asian descent. And I got interested in this because my son is a mixture of both these cultures. He has a Chinese mother, and I'm sort of Dutch American. But I was wondering, like, does he have some kind of cognition from these either sides. And one of the things they found was if they show people a series of 3 items in a slide, it's like a cow, and it's a dog, and it's some grass. And they say, like, quickly, without thinking too much, pair 2 of these together. Westerners will tend to pair the cow and the dog together, whereas Easterners will tend to pair the cow and the grass together. And this is kind of exciting because it suggests that whether it's innate or whether it's cultural, we might be sort of excluding or including the contexts better in some cultures than in others. So cows eat grass. So that's the tendency in Asia, is to put the thing in its actual environment, because there's a recognition that nothing is entirely independent. Everything is dependent on something else. Whereas the West, we celebrate the kind of, the independence of everything, including the individual.
Another person from the audience is relating to Panksepp's work on universal and maybe even trans species structures, because he has, from my knowledge, also done a lot of animal research on these emotional systems. So he is asking, is there a pathway from these systems to collective healing or rituals of collective healing, also in ritual, or do you see any path from there to these more social performances?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't given a lot of thought to this, but it's got to be right. I mean, one thing I remember, I think before YouTube, the only thing you had was your pet and your friend's pets to compare notes on. But with the rise of a video system where people love to share their animal videos, there's a remarkable amount of data that shows not just cognitive sophistication of animals, but tremendous social intelligence, and a kind of the way in which animals engage in affective, like when they're stimulated to an emotion like anger or they're frightened. It's very interesting to see how do animals, particularly social animals, then quell those fears. How do they, as a social group, reduce the anxiety? How do they reduce the anger? And I do think that there is culture among animals, that primates show cultural transmission. They have affective springs of action, but then they have layered on top of that cultural traditions. So for example, chimps are notoriously aggressive, and they're fairly violent. And if you look at their nearest relatives and our nearest relatives, the bonobos, you see a radically different cultural adjusting of these affective springs. So if you look at this further, you see, well, there's some interesting ways in which bonobos, once they get upset, like they did all these experiments, I think people are familiar with Franz de Waal's great work, where oftentimes when bonobos get upset as a group, in order to manage that stress or anxiety, they start to begin, they begin to engage in sex. So males and females will have sex, males and males, females and females. A lot of this activity, we know when we first saw it, we were like, what's going on here? It's why it's hard to have bonobos in the zoo, because kids are utterly fascinated by this behavior. But what's happening neurochemically is that if you have a rage system that's starting to happen, one of the things that reduces that is the activation of oxytocin and endogenous opioids like endorphins. Sex is a very good way to ramp up those neurotransmitters, which basically overrides the rage response. And so it seems to me that you do have these cross-species emotional trajectories that then mix with the cultures of the primates and produce a different way of managing violence among the group. And this can even go further. Like one of the reasons why we think that chimps are so aggressive is because it's it's not a patriarchy in the traditional, in the gorilla sense of a silverback, but it is a band of brothers that runs the societies. And hunting then is a way in which to get access to females. So chimpanzees will hunt for meat and then use it in sexual politics to try to get access to females. Among bonobos, there's closer sort of sexual, the sexual dimorphism isn't as strong as it is in chimps. So females are very big and strong, and it tends to be a matriarchy rather than a patriarchy. As a result of it, females and males eat a lot of vegetables, fruits rather, and the hunting doesn't really happen as much for them. So all of these access to food and resources, I think, then combined with affective or emotional systems, create these cultural differences. And I think that we could, look at our animal cousins and learn a lot about healthier ways to manage social anxiety and so forth, and social aggression.
Yeah, very interesting. And also what comes to my mind when thinking about the relationship of these maybe innate structures and social performance. In rituals, we often have dramatic stories unfolding in a social group that take people to the same or a similar level, collective level of emotional expression. So just relating that to your threat rehearsal slide, could be social rehearsal of emotions, which could be for some therapeutic, but for the culture at all, a way of showing itself which kind of emotions are acceptable, which not, and where to transcend the normal way of expressing emotions. So from the ritual or performative research side, this is also an interesting question when we look at postmodern societies where we have a lot of rationalism too, or the demand for rationalism, and also looking into monitors a lot. So the rehearsal of emotions might not be as expanded as in more traditional societies where ritual and performances play a role.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, the ritualistic aspects of religion, but also art and theater, are extremely cathartic and helpful. We've known about this for a while, and it's just exciting to think that the artist has a greater moral responsibility in a way to help the society. And one of the things about the imagination, I've been working on a piece with the great actor Paul Giamatti on the imagination, and he and I have talked about the imagination has great power to bring people together, but also you have to be very careful how you use it, because it can easily demonize others and reduce the empathy of us towards other groups. And so it's a huge responsibility, the imagination.
Yeah. So parts of our audience come from clinical disciplines. So maybe the following question relates to that. Do you believe imagination training can be used to serve society?
Oh, yes.
Why? Why so?
I think so many features of the imagination are left out of contemporary educational philosophy. I mean, I think there's a lot of recognition that it's important, but it's mostly lip service. People don't put their money where their mouth is. And the first thing to get cut is arts, education and so forth. But I think there's a lot of evidence that becoming good and sort of imaginatively literate has many, what I would call crossover skills. For example, many people who are trained in music end up doing very well on other kinds of cognition, including mathematics and other kinds of problem solving. But I would, as a philosopher, I don't really want to reduce everything down to its utilitarian function. The imagination is its own rich life that, all of us are engaging in it. Anyway, it would be better if we could learn that was part of our operating system, and then to refine it and cultivate it better. So for example, when if you look recently here in the US, there was an election, which I'm sure people have been following. It's a contest of mythopoetic stories. And both sides think that they're the righteous hero, and the other side is the nefarious evildoer. And it's quite dramatic. I mean, people have actually lost their lives in what is essentially a kind of mythopoetic version of politics. I can't say that I've ever seen it so dramatically mythopoetic in its language, in its imagery, and the fact that a lot of people don't realize that they're contributing a kind of imaginative interpretation of the facts, and then they don't see that their projection or imaginings are actually part of what they think are the facts, ends up making us highly intolerant and uncharitable towards other views. So imaginative education is also a way, in philosophy we do this a lot, we try to inhabit what other people's arguments are, or what their viewpoint is. And it's a work of imagination. It's hard to do, it's not obvious, it's not easy, but in doing it, you come to understand somebody without necessarily agreeing with them. And that's something that's sorely lacking. And I think imaginative education could not only give us things like better image literacy, but also understand people's belief systems better.
Same person was also asking, are imaginations in your view repressed in our current culture?
I think that
imagination repressed? Yeah.
Yes, I do think so. I will say I lived in China for a while, for 2 years, on and off, and my son went to school in China. And I will say, there are stereotypes about some cultures are more imaginative than others. Some cultures are more innovative than others. Of course, the stereotype is that in China, it's more drill and kill, rote memorization, do well on the exams, very little imagination. There's definitely some truth in that. I remember they tried to overcome this tendency by creating a kind of imagination or creativity curricula, which they then tried to spread through some of the grade schools there. This was about 10 years ago. And then they asked sort of educators from all around the world to come and evaluate the program. And when the evaluators got there, what they found was, under the auspices of imagination curriculum or creativity curriculum, what teachers were actually doing was requiring the students to memorize Tang Dynasty poetry and then just say the poems out loud. Mm-hmm. Now that's really not the kind of imagination or creativity work that produces something original or innovative. And so, the West oftentimes sees itself, and I think rightly, as prizing innovation, and sometimes it's rewarded, and you can see it in the technology and so forth. But these are different views about what knowledge is. In the East, knowledge is not about individual innovation, but mastery of the deep reservoir of wisdom. That's how you become wise. It's the Confucian influence. And in the West, the idea is that you should do something new. So there is a tendency, I think, for greater imagination and innovation in Western education. But again, it's still very underappreciated.
Yeah. So 2 or 3 more, I think we can do. So
right.
You've been talking about the creative process and citing the metaphor to fish in the subconscious. Yeah. So what role does generally stress, like procrastination, play in fishing in the unconsciousness? Is there a relationship?
Yeah, this is a great question. It depends on how you define stress, right? Because
as eustress or distress, or
like there's some stress that is adaptive because it forces you to solve the problem. So one of the things I'm very interested in, because I play jazz music, is I'm very interested in improvisation. And one of the things that improvisers do frequently is they put themselves under duress. Like, let's say you and I are going to perform tomorrow night at the club. And what we'll do then is we'll say, well, we're going to do a couple of these songs, but we won't rehearse. And that's very frightening because you're going to be in front of a bunch of people. And the idea is that if you've mastered your instrument and you're open and porous to the other person's creativity, then together you will have a synergetic moment. And what makes it happen is in some ways the stress of performing in front of people where you could really screw this up. So stress can be extremely adaptive to the creative process. On the other hand, there's also a lot of data that shows too much stress and we stop thinking creatively altogether, and we sort of hunker down and the mind closes down options and possibilities. So it's really it's a case of finding the Goldilocks, the sweet spot between too much and too little stress, I think. But that's just a short answer to a very complicated question.
Okay, Evelyn asks, you were mentioning that narratives are a form of adaptive imagination and a form of threat rehearsal. Do you believe that dreams are a form of adaptive imagination or some sort of life experience rehearsed?
Yes, I do. And that my view has changed on that to accept dreams as being deeply meaningful. I think early in my career, I thought, oh, dreams are just noise. It's just, you shut the machine off and you just get nonsense. I've changed my mind on this. And I do think that, in fact, what's happening is dreams are a kind of, there's very little executive control in dreams. Although if you study, certain kinds of dreaming, lucid dreaming, you can get more executive control in dreams. But for the most part, it's associational. What I think is happening is the mind and the body are recording all kinds of emotional information throughout the day. And then what's happening is in the dreaming state, the mind is working through some scenarios and trying to, in a sense, how do I put this? Not codify, but solidify possibly successful behavioral strategies for waking life. So I'm just sort of riffing here, but let's say you get a new boss and this person seems very hostile to you and you can't figure out the way to work with them. And then you have a dream. And the dream is you sort of working with and around this emotionally difficult person. And then what's happening is that your brain doesn't know you're dreaming. Like, it really doesn't know. What's happened is sleep atonia just switches off your body so that you don't run from the monster when you're dreaming of a monster. But for all intents and purposes, you are running from a monster. That's how your brain sees it. And then you wake up. And my view is that what's happening is that these experiences, memories, images, narratives, are all coded with affect. These are called somatic markers in sort of the psychology of somebody like Antonio Damasio. And what's happening is that in the dream world, those somatic marker images and narratives are working out in some way. And sometimes this produces really adaptive responses in waking life. Sometimes it's just confusing and it's not clear how it maps on to waking life. But I do think that there is sense making and meaning making in dreams.
Sense making and meaning making. So a question for me. So how do the different faculties or characteristics of the mind, mental faculties, actually work together? Do narrative structures control imaginative processes or vice versa? And how does the embodied mind interact with that?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm working on this now. The journal, the Evolutionary Studies in Imaginative Culture, has commissioned a target article. So this is on my mind and I'm working on it now. I think that the way it's traditionally been done is you look at the particles of like a story, let's say, like the images, and you try to build up the narrative from these ingredients. And philosophers have been doing this, right? This is what Bertrand Russell was doing with sense impressions and trying to connect it with, with logic. I think this is the wrong approach, and that in fact the human mind is already in a world in the way that Heidegger would describe, for example, and that means that we're already in a mythopoetic story. where the images and the component parts are only separable through a kind of rational reconstruction. The child is not aware of the parts of the drama that it's living in. It knows that it's the protagonist. It knows that much, and it knows who the enemies are and who the friends are. But it's not cobbling together these parts. Now, I'm not sure then what to make of this, because if we then set aside the phenomenological and we think about it as cognitive scientists, something like a compositional architecture must be in play for all of this to work. But I think it's probably, you've got a small range of narrative arcs, and then you've got imagery that can basically slot in. And then these are, like Johnson and Lakoff talked about metaphors, these then can be applied from a source domain to a target domain. And once you're engaged in the activity, then you project, your experience with your mother onto all women. And then from there, you have new experiences and you bring that back, and you're unconsciously tinkering with these schema. So something like that's going on.
So last question, what is the most important thing that therapists can learn from redefining the mind with those imaginative capacities and others? What do you think what the therapist should take from that, or could take from that?
Well, here my views are like anyone else's, because this is not my field of expertise. So I'm just really speculating here a little bit. It seems to me that, of course, the therapeutic tradition of the talking cure, goes back to Freud, and the idea that you could essentially retell your story in a way that was therapeutic. There's lots of evidence that works and that's healthy. On the other hand, I think I'm probably not telling the therapists anything new, but I think for me it's exciting to note that there's many other ways for us to convey our autobiographical story. Imagery, even performing or enacting certain kinds of events seems to be very therapeutic. That study that I referred to earlier was a case where therapists were actually very carefully using movies with their clients to try to bring together the sort of monsters that the subject or the patient was experiencing, together with a more positive narrative arc of monstrosity, such that it was therapeutic. So I'm out of my depth here, but I think that more embodied ways of therapy follow from my general theories of the imagination.
Thank you, Stephen. That was a great conversation and a great presentation, and hope to see you back in another part of the Mind Academy journey, maybe next year on Insight Conference.
That'd be great.
And would be great. So thank you. Yeah, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you to the audience.
Thank you. This was it for this year. Let's meet again next year. We have extremely interesting stuff coming up in January, a more therapeutic series about ketamine and its application in therapies, and a lot more. So bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.